This is a presentation I gave to the Northwest Historical Association on the 16th October 2019 called The Forgotten Sieges of the Maiden City. Now, it is largely the same presentation, but I have updated it slightly for new information I've become aware of since. The first slide is very much an introduction to me as the presenter. So for those who don't know me, my name is David Douglas, and although I am an accountant by profession, I am a historian by passion. Last year I started a walking tour business in the city called Derry Danders Walking Tours. The Derry is spelt with an IE to reflect the original name of the city on maps and other documents used by the planters. It also has the advantage of being politically neutral and avoiding the Derry or the Londonderry debate, and can be abbreviated to DD Walking Tours. A number of months ago, when I first suggested to Roy and Ian of the committee the topic of a talk to the North West Historic Society of the forgotten sieges of the Maiden City, it was because I thought there had been very little time given to these topics in the local history scene. However, in the last month, both the Siege Museum and the Friends of the Derry Walls have organised either displays or lectures on this particular topic. If you now visit the Siege Museum, on the ground floor in the wall directly behind reception, you have some display boards covering the subject matter, and I refer more to these during my talk. Also on the 14th of September 2019, as part of their contribution to the European Heritage Weekend by the Friends of the Derry Walls, in this very room, Professor Patrick Lenihan of NUI Galway delivered a lecture entitled Cities Under Siege, Derry and Clonmel 1649 to 50. Were anybody present at this lecture? Well, if you were, you will be relieved to know that I won't be repeating it, but there may be some important points that I may refer to in the course of my talk. So how many sieges of Derry have there been? Can I ask you for a show of hands, how many people think there was just the one siege of Derry? Many think two, many think three, many think four, and many think five or more. But during the actual talk, I think the majority of people came down on the side of two. So the answer is three. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The Great Siege of 1688 to 89, the Siege of 1649 as part of the British Civil Wars, but also the Siege of 1641 to 42 as part of the Irish Rebellion. But there was feedback taken at the meeting, and there are possibly some other answers too. Again, it depends on what you consider to be a siege, and I'll define that at a later stage. But if you just classed everything, even though it may only be a battle, you could argue that there have been 7 sieges of Derry. And we're going to take a look briefly now at those of the Vikings, of 1608, of 1969 to 72, and the current situation. So please feel free to pause the video and read through the facts up on the screen in more detail. But you could argue that there were ongoing battles and possibly a siege between the kings of the area and the Vikings. You could possibly also argue that when Sir Cathal Doherty attacked the city in 1608 and destroyed it again, killing the Governor Paulet, that might have been classed as a siege. Some people would say that the establishment of Free Derry in 1969, up until the barricades were taken down by the British Army in 1972, was also a siege within the city. And if you go to the fountain, you will still see a mural pointed out that the people there still consider themselves very much still under siege. So what actually is the definition of a siege? It can be defined as a military operation in which enemy forces surround a town or building, cutting off essential supplies with the aim of compelling those inside to surrender. It is a prolonged military assault and blockade on a city or fortress with the intent of conquering by force or attrition. Or it's a period of surrounding and blockading of a fortified place, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. In French, the word siège means seat in English, something you would see if you happen to be travelling on a train in France. Now, I think it is important to distinguish between a siege and a battle, because there would have been considerably more battles in and around the city during its history, between the Gaelic chieftains, as we already mentioned, between the chieftains and the Vikings, between the Irish chieftains and the Normans, between Irish chieftains and Scottish chieftains, with the English garrison in 1567, Joffre in 1600, Cathal O'Doherty in 1608, the 1640s, and not forgetting the role of the city in the Battle of the Atlantic between 1939 and 1945, and then possibly the Cold War in the 1950s and 60s with the US naval listening post in the city. And we could argue that in the year 2020 we were all under siege from the coronavirus pandemic. In fact, it could be argued that in the period 1940 to 1944, the whole of the United Kingdom was under siege from the Germans, who controlled Europe and also the seas through the U-boat menace, though the domination of the skies was still held by the RAF after the Battle of Britain. In a slight aside, I am always fascinated by the picture of the German U-boats which surrendered in Lissahalli after May 1945, which were mostly scrapped and then sunk in deep water out in the Atlantic. I have heard some of them may have been sold to the Russians. But it would have been great if one of these could have been retained and could become part of their long promised maritime museum in the city. Although this talk is about forgotten sieges, I think it would be quite interesting to consider some famous sieges in history and literature. There's a website out there called ranker.com, which ranks the top 50 sieges in history as rated by the internet community. Now, this was at October 2019. Ranked 1, the sieges of Constantinople. There were approximately 20 sieges between 478 BC and 1453 between Greeks, Romans, Crusaders, and Muslims/Turks of the Ottoman Empire. Rank 2 was the Siege of Leningrad in World War II between September 1941 and January 1944, which lasted 900 days and had the deaths of approximately 1.5 million Russian civilians and soldiers, and probably a good half a million German soldiers as well. Ranked 6, we have the Siege of Troy in 1200 BC, when Greeks besieged the city of Troy. And this siege lasted 10 years and finally ended with the trick of the wooden horse. Ranked 7 is the Battle of the Alamo, the 13-day siege between the forces of Texas and Mexico. And this involved both Davy Crockett, whose ancestors came either from Castlederg or Donegal, depending on which literature you read, and Sam Houston, who was also an Ulster Scot or Scots-Irish descent. Ranked 8 was the Siege of Malta between 1940 to 42, after which the island was awarded the George Cross, which features on its flag, and its famous commander during that time was Lord Mountbatten. Ranked 9 was the Siege of Masada between 73 to 74 AD, when Romans besieged Jewish rebels and ended up with a mass suicide of the rebels to avoid capture. Ranked 41, the highest Irish ranked siege, is the Siege of Galway between August 1651 to May 1652 as part of the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland. And where, might you ask, is the Great Siege of Derry, 1688 to 89? Well, it's not included in the top 50 in Ranker.com. Lord Macaulay said in his History of England, it was the most memorable in the annals of the British Isles, and I would often repeat that in my tours. But remember, we all know the internet can't be trusted. So much for Ranker.com. I think we should now spend a few moments to consider the famous Great Siege of 1688 to 89 to ascertain why it is so important, and perhaps get an inkling as to why the other sieges are largely forgotten. I already referred you to Lord Macaulay's comment, and that is the abridged copy of that book is now on the screen in front of you. I don't intend to spend too much time talking about the detail of the Great Siege, as there is a specific museum dedicated to it in this city, the Siege Museum, as well as sections of the Chapter House Museum in St Columb's Cathedral and parts of the Tower Museum. Also, if you would take a walking tour of the city and its walls, such as Derry Danders walking tours, you will learn a bit more about this siege. The siege began on the 7th of December 1688, when 13 apprentice boys closed the city's gates to keep out the garrison of Redshanks, which was a regiment of Catholics sent from Antrim to replace the withdrawn garrison of Mountjoy and Lundy. The siege proper did not begin until late March 1689, when King James arrived at Bishopsgate, with a largely French army having marched north through Ireland after landing in Kinsale. The siege lasted 105 days and ended on the 1st of August 1689, a few days after the Mountjoy had broken the boom with the tragic loss of her captain Micaiah Browning, a Derry man himself who is now buried in the grounds of the nearby St Columb's Cathedral. The modern-day organisation of the Apprentice Boys parades twice a year, normally on the 18th of December and the 12th of August, though the December parade has recently been moved forward to facilitate Christmas trading. Pope Gregory changed the calendar, and therefore the actual dates were moved forward 11 days. I also think the jury is out on Lundy as a traitor. I think he was more of a pragmatist, as he spent considerable time ensuring the city was fortified between December 1688 and March 1689, and him being a traitor is not consistent with that. However, he probably felt the odds were stacked against the defenders of the city and they would be safer surrendering. He was never actually convicted of treason by the English Parliament either, and went on to serve again in the English army. But the innocence of Lundy is perhaps a topic for another talk. The Siege Museum has produced this interesting booklet, which gives a siege timeline that covers the main facts of the siege and is very much worth a read. Also, if you want to read the most authentic eyewitness account, uh, this book by Captain Thomas Ashe has recently been produced again, and copies are available at St Columb's Cathedral. Captain Thomas Ashe was also the brother of Jane Browning, who was the wife of Micaiah Browning, the captain of the Mountjoy. Another interesting book about the siege is that of Richard Doherty, A Military History. He states that for 105 days, a small city located in the periphery of Europe in the northwest of Ireland was the hinge around the whole of a European conflict, the War of the Grand Alliance. The resistance of Derry gave William the breathing space he needed before he sent a force to Ireland and Scotland. It prevented the Jacobites from getting back their throne, and apart from a short rebellion in 1745, the Jacobites never threatened again. The Jacobites would mostly have used Derry as a port for getting their army to Scotland and then march on to England. So the resistance of the city very much stopped that. The theatre of this European war moved out of Ireland after the Treaty of 1691, but unfortunately it could be said that the Irish have continued to fight this war ever since. One of the important triggers for the closing of the gates by the apprentice boys in December 1688 was the Cumber Letter. Now, genuinely, it is believed to be a hoax, but it was found in the village of Cumber, County Down, on the 3rd of December, and it was written as a native Irishman warning a local lord that Irishmen had sworn to kill all the English and Scottish planters on the 9th of December. This increased the fears of the people of Ulster, and especially the people of Derry, as a Catholic garrison was coming there, and it brought back memories of the 1641 rebellion and the atrocities and massacres that were committed then, that was still fresh in the minds of the Protestant people. It is now that rebellion and the 1641 to 42 siege we will now address in our talk. On the 23rd of October 1641, an attempt was made to take Dublin Castle by Conor Maguire and Hugh McMahon, who were descendants of the Gaelic lords who had left Ireland from Rathmullen in 1607 in the infamous Flight of the Earls. This failed due to the garrison being strengthened, as one of the conspirators had leaked the plan when he was drunk. This was not the first time that careless words through drink had scuppered an Irish rebellion. A similar situation happened in the Great Northern Plot of 1615, which led to the O'Cahans being imprisoned and some of them executed, and their lands in County Coleraine being renamed County Londonderry and being taken by the Crown. However, in the same day in 1641, Phelim O'Neill, the Lord of Dungannon, also rebelled in the north, and was successful in attacking and seizing the towns of Armagh, Newry, and Dungannon. Phelim O'Neill proclaimed his loyalty to Charles I, but his hope was that the rebels could force Charles I and his Parliament to introduce religious liberty to Ireland and give back the Catholic lords their privileged positions again. They were probably buoyed by the success that the Scottish lords had when they resisted Charles I's imposition of a high Anglican church regime in the War of the Bishops. Charles was already in a weak position, having had to battle with his Parliament for taxes to fund these wars, and his Parliament had become increasingly dominated by people from a Reformed Protestant faith, namely Puritans. Unfortunately, although Phelim O'Neill may have asked for no bloodshed against the English and Scottish planters, he was powerless to resist the violence that followed. While initially the violence was aimed at the upper class planter English Anglicans, eventually all planters, English and Scottish, Anglican and Presbyterian, were attacked by the native Irish rebels. In many ways it was easier for the Scottish to escape back to Scotland, and many thousands did so. It is perhaps too simplistic to say that the native Irish rebelled because their land had been taken by the planters, because an Irish peasant was not much worse off with a planter landlord than a Gaelic one. But certainly a religious dimension was there that had not been there before, and you could argue that this pervades to the present day. Both sides, Catholics and Protestants, were guilty of atrocities, but in this particular conflict it was probably the Catholics who had the greater guilt. In Portadown, hundreds of Protestants were tied up, stripped, and thrown into the river to die of exposure or to drown. As a result of this, people fled to the fortified towns of Carrickfergus, Cork, Drogheda, and of course, Londonderry. It is hard to know exactly how many died during this time. The later depositions given would suggest up to 100,000, but a more reasonable estimate is about 12,000 of the 40,000 planters in the province either perished or left. One of the results of this was probably to create a distrust of the Catholic Irish population by a young parliamentarian called Oliver Cromwell, who would return to the Ireland in the 1650s with devastating consequences. Just a brief word about the European context at this time. There was a 30-year religious war in Europe between 1618 to 1648, largely between the forces of the Counter-Reformation, the Habsburgs, and some German Protestant states and a Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus. He was killed at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632. The armies on both sides contained a number of Scottish and Irish troops, who then came back to Ulster with military skills they had learned and would put to use again in the Irish Rebellion. There was also a Scottish General Monro, who in 1642 led a Scottish army in Ulster and has a bad reputation for what he did round the north coast. Also the famous Owen Roe O'Neill, of whom so many GAA clubs are named after, a descendant of Hugh O'Neill of the Flight of the Earls and a nephew of Phelim O'Neill, and he would eventually become a commander of the more organised Gaelic Ulster Army. But there was also Robert Stewart, and he had connections with the Stewarts of Ramelton and Newton Stewart, and he would become one of the leaders of a force known as the Lagan Army. This force had an important role in both the 1641-42 siege and the later 1649 siege. Initially, as part of the relieving force or guarding force, but then part of the besieging force. There are many people in this room or maybe watching this video who know a lot more about the Lagan Army than me, but forgive me if I just simplify it and just talk about the context around the siege of Derry. The Lagan Army was so called because it had its base in the Lagan district of East Donegal, and it was mainly a militia force of the Scottish settlers in that area, who grouped together to protect themselves against the Irish rebels. They also drew people from counties Derry, Tyrone and Fermanagh, and some English settlers, but the majority were Scottish Presbyterians. The two main leaders were the younger Robert Stewart, who had military experience in the 1630s, and he commanded Comoor Fort, and then also the older William Stewart from Mamelton, who in 1608 had helped quell the rebellion of Cathal O'Doherty. Now, these are two very interesting booklets, both produced by the Ulster Scots Agency, and definitely well worth a read. So, in the context of the siege of Derry, although Derry was viewed as a secure haven for the planters, it had been reported that there were only a few rotten culverins or cannons and not 100 swords in the whole city. Until later in the 1640s, when the City of London sent cannons and ammunition, the leaders of the Lagan army largely financed the upkeep of the army themselves, though from time to time their members would go back into the fields to sow and harvest their crops. Some reports say that in return for creating a security ring around the city, the citizens of the city provided them with food and drink. Most of the large cannons that you will see on the bastions of the city, such as Roaring Meg, were given by the London companies as a result of the Irish Rebellion and the need to protect the city. The Lagan army formed itself into 4 regiments of foot and 3 troops of horse. There were also 6 companies formed in Londonderry under the Mayor/Governor Sir John Vaughan, and 6 at Coleraine under Sir Thomas Phillips. There were also forces under the fighting Bishop Leslie of Rievaulx. Initially, the Lagan army deployed itself as a defensive force and was successful in keeping the armies of Phelim O'Neill as far back as Strabane in December 1641. In March 1642, the Lagan army began an offensive campaign that in 1642 resulted in the recapture of Strabane and, in reality, the relief of the city. There was also a decisive counter at Glenmaquin, near Convoy, County Donegal, which effectively ended the rebellion in this part of the Ulster. The picture shown is of a reenactment there by the local Ulster Scots Association a few years ago. Later in 1642, a Scottish army under General Monro became active in the east of Ulster, and in 1643 the Lagan army had a successful encounter with an army of Owen Roe O'Neill. In September 1643, there was a cessation of arms between the Royalist forces and what was now known as the Catholic Confederacy, made up of Anglo-Irish, Norman and Gaelic lords. This was partly to allow breathing space for Charles to try and recruit an Irish army to fight against his other main foes, his own Parliament. While the Laganeers had been mainly royalist up to this point, many of them now signed the Scottish Solemn Leave and Covenant, which bound the Scots to ally the Parliament against the King, and there was also another oath known as the Black Oath during this time. So why was the 1641 to 42 siege being forgotten? I'll give you just some of my thoughts. Well, it wasn't a siege at all. The closest the rebels got really to the city was Strabane. It's been overshadowed by the sectarian aspects of the 1641 rebellion, and especially when the depositions were taken and all the atrocities, information about the atrocities came out. Again, it's also been overshadowed by the British Civil Wars, which really kind of lasted between 1638 in Scotland to the early in the 1650s when Cromwell came over to Ireland. And again, there is a lack of information about that. There wasn't the same level of information kept as there was in the Great Siege of Derry, apart from the depositions which were taken. And again, these are available in Trinity College in Dublin if you would want to check them out online. And now we're going to consider the period between 1642 to 49, normally classed as those of the English Civil Wars, though in reality they were British Civil Wars because they included Scotland and Ireland. I have already talked about what happened in Ulster up to September 1643 and the problems that the local Presbyterians found themselves in, and particularly to move from being royalist supporters to being parliamentarian supporters. In Scotland, there had been a series of wars with Charles I, and given the flow of people between Ulster and Scotland, this must have impacted greatly on the Scottish planters. Charles I was, after all, a Stuart and part of a Scottish royal family. Scots wanted to stay loyal to the king, but also wanted to adhere to their new true religion, which was now Presbyterianism. From a doctrinal point of view, they were very similar to the English Puritans, and during this period of time, the Westminster Confession of Faith and the longer and shorter catechisms were adopted by a group called the Westminster Divines, which included both Presbyterians and Puritans. The main differences were in the systems of church government. Both opposed the rule of bishops, while one favoured presbyteries, the others a series of independent congregations. If Ireland and Scotland were messes politically, then so much more was England, and the three civil wars of 1642 to 47, 48 to 49, and 49 to 51 showed that. Now, time does not permit us to go into these in any detail, but the situation was at least as confusing as the modern day Brexit chaos we've just lived through. In 1648, the independents and leaders of the New Model Army gained control of the Parliamentary Party, and in a coup known as Pride's Purge, the Presbyterians were removed and a small or rump parliament was formed. Oliver Cromwell became the military leader of the parliament, and in January 1649, this group got Charles I beheaded. England was now a commonwealth or republic. This caused a great uproar in Scotland and Ulster, as though there was no love for the policies or religious practices of the king, there was still respect for the divine right of kings. Early in 1649, the Scottish Parliament declared for Charles I as their king, and although he was only 19 and exiled in Scotland, this royalist settlement started to flow into Ulster too. And on the screen I'd been showing the Solemn League and Covenant that was going around at that time. And if you read the language of it, you might find it similar to another more modern document. Can anybody guess what that was? Yes, in 1912, Ulster's Solemn League and Covenant that was signed by approximately 230,000 men, and women also signed another document known as the Declaration. But if you read the wording of that, you'll find it's very similar to some of the earlier covenants too. Another interesting character that comes on the siege at this point is Sir Charles Coote. His father had also been called Charles Coote and had been very active in suppressing the Irish rebellion in Clontarf and County Wicklow, and had a reputation for disliking the native Irish and for being quite brutal, and his son probably inherited such beliefs. After his father's death, he travelled to England to lobby the king to agitate for harsher measures against Catholics during the 1643 cessation of hostilities. However, the king did not agree to these requests, possibly because he could see the need for Irish help in his own civil war. So Coote decided to join the Parliamentarians, and in 1645 he returned to Ireland to lead their army in the north and west of Ulster. In late 1645, assisted by the Lagan army, he captured the city of Sligo. There had been other armies in Ulster too, that of Monroe in the east of the province, but it had been heavily defeated by Owen Roe O'Neill in 1646 at the Battle of Benburb. But instead of pressing home his advantage, O'Neill turned south and went to assist another army, that of the papal nuncio Rinuccini, who had arrived in Ireland too to be the Pope's representative, but had formed his own army as he disagreed with the Irish Confederacy and their alliance with King Charles I. However, he was not successful and eventually returned to Rome. Between 1648 and 1649, the only military action happening in Ireland was in the north. The Parliamentarian forces only held certain big cities, those of Dublin, Dundalk, Drogheda, Carrickfergus, and of course Londonderry. An army was being raised by Oliver Cromwell to come to Ireland, but it was a few months before it could get across, so it was important for these towns to hold out and maintain a garrison to assist that army when it arrived. Sir Charles Coote held the city, but he had concerns about his former ally Sir Robert Stewart, who still had some royalist allegiances, and he controlled the Lagan army from his fort at Kilmore. Coote heard that Stewart was attending a baptism in the city, and he arranged for him to be arrested and then sent to the Tower of London. At this point, he now got control of Kilmore Fort, which allowed him to control shipping in and out of the city. Although the Lagan army greatly dwarfed Coote's army, it was badly resourced and now had no leader, until the nephew of Sir Robert, Alexander, took command, and in March 1649 a siege began by the Lagan army against Coote that would last until August 1649. If you remember, we discussed cannons that were sent to the city in the mid-1640s by the London companies. Well, these were now in control of Coote. So in reality, these were now Republican cannons, and I think that's an interesting thing given the culture that the cannons now form part of. The initial strategy of the Lagan army was that of starving out the garrison, and they did so by coming closer to the city and securing the townlands of Manor Cunningham, Carrigans, and Muff that supplied the foodstuffs to Coote. However, on the 23rd of April, Coote himself led a cavalry party out of the city and attacked the Lagan army base at Carrigans, seizing food and supplies and killing a lot of their men. This boosted the morale of the garrison and was also a disgrace to the Lagan army. Alexander Stewart now moved his forces closer to the city. In May, Robert Stewart returned, having escaped from the Tower of London, and other forces joined them, including Scottish Covenanters, Irish Confederates, English Royalists. And although these boosted the numbers, it did lead to sectarian tensions. The Allies now set about building a fort between Kilmore and Londonderry, and this was known as Charles Fort, and this would allow them to attack shipping. These allies also brought more cannons and artillery, although the strategy still seemed to be a blockade rather than an outright military attack. By the way, in the picture is Owen Roe O'Neill, and we'll talk a little bit more about him towards the end. Hugh Montgomery was Charles II's chosen commander, and he arrived on the scene and called for Coote to surrender. But Coote also attempted to attack the Charles's fort. Also during this time, many of the lagging army left due to the sectarian divisions, as many did not like Montgomery as he was quite uncouth. At times he even went into the city to have dinner with Coote, and publicly said he preferred the company of the Coote and the Parliamentarians to his Scottish and Irish allies. On August the 7th, an unexpected turn of events occurred, when Owen Roe O'Neill arrived with his Gaelic Ulster army, coming from the direction of Ballykelly. However, instead of joining the besiegers, they set up to attack them, and the forces of Stewart and Montgomery, which were now badly outnumbered, withdrew. The city was saved, the Royalist garrison at the Charles Fort surrendered, and Coote and Owen Roe O'Neill, former enemies, were now allies. And I think there's an interesting quote from Coote in connection with this, that God sometimes makes use of wicked instruments to bring about good design. And that was what Coote said about Owen Roe O'Neill. So why did Owen Roe O'Neill get into bed with the Parliamentarians instead of sticking with the Royalists? Well, probably it was pragmatism. He could see the way the wind was blowing in England and Scotland, and he knew a strong army under Cromwell's new model army would soon be coming to Ireland. However, if he had stayed in the south and linked up with the Royalist and Confederacy forces, he possibly could have conquered Dublin, and then Cromwell would not have had a base for his landing the next year. However, the alliance with Coote did not last long. Cromwell had no trust for the Gaelic Irish, and by November 1649, Owen Roe O'Neill was dead, allegedly poisoned by a priest under the payroll of the English. But that's another story. Coote also had brutally murdered Owen O'Neill's son. Cromwell easily defeated what remained of the Gaelic Irish armies, and he offered them a choice of going to hell or Connaught. You see the picture of Cromwell there, and that picture is interesting because the phrase warts and all comes from the fact that Cromwell would not allow his portraits of the time to be photoshopped in the ancient sense. The Ulster Scots were treated better, most of them being allowed to return to their farms. Alexander Stewart went to Edinburgh, but eventually was killed fighting for the Scots against the Parliamentarians. Robert Stewart, initially exiled in Scotland, returned and came back to Kilmore. Cromwell is remembered for the brutal way he conquered some of the cities in Ireland that held out against them, though it was not just the Irish Catholics he massacred. He also massacred English and Scottish royalists as well. However, by 1660, Charles II had been restored to the throne. Cromwell had died in 1658, and his son Richard could not keep the Commonwealth Republic together. So hated was Cromwell that although he was already dead and buried in Westminster Abbey, his body was dug up, he was hung, drawn, and quartered, and his head put up on a post. The picture you see is of Raphoe Castle, and I always feel that this was a really mixed up time if you were a Presbyterian, and certainly in the Lagan army, because they went from being royalist to parliamentarian, and the whole thing was very much mixed up. Another interesting thing that has come out of the 1649 siege was the citadel. It is now believed that a citadel was created in the city in an area around the cathedral, between the two remaining sentry posts on the walls. Previous research suggested that this had only been for the duration of the 1649 siege, but recently information has come to light that suggested this may have lasted right up to the date of the restoration of the monarchy. The parliamentarians were not popular with most people in the city, whether they were Scottish Presbyterian, English Royalist, or native Irish. As they were likely to have been a minority in the city, they would have needed protection themselves from the majority of the city inhabitants. It is also believed that by turning the cathedral into this citadel, they were pouring scorn on the more traditional religion rather than their more Puritan beliefs. The Friends of the Derry Walls is currently carrying out some research with QUB on the subject of mapping the citadel, so more information may come to rise shortly. So why has the 1649 siege been largely forgotten in reference to the 1688-89 siege? Well, one thing is there probably is a lot less information available. Most of the information we have is from two letters a man called Finch, one of Coote's officers, wrote to his friends in London during the siege. The main academic study I could find was in the Billy Kelly book, The Sieges of Derry, and only the second chapter, which runs to 22 pages. There were also a lot less of the personal narratives that had been written by, say, Walker and Ashe and Mackenzie, as happened in the later siege. It was certainly less important from a European perspective. It only really had an Irish stroke British perspective. It was certainly more complex. Certainly the Presbyterians, the Scottish, the English were royalist. There were so many other factors there. There could have been 5 or 6 armies in Ireland at that time, and we also have the papal nuncio there as well. So that was a very complicated period of history. And certainly it doesn't follow into the simplistic orange versus green narrative that most people think of Ireland now. Not only do you have Protestants killing other Protestants and allying themselves with strange bedfellows, you also have Owen Roe O'Neill allying himself with a Puritan parliamentarian army too, against his fellow Catholics in the Confederacy, who were royalists. In the later siege, you had a lot of heroes in the form of Browning, Baker, Walker, Murray, Mitchelburn. But you could argue in this particular siege, you had a lot more traitors, as everybody seemed to change side at least once during the situation. Again, there was a lot less casualties. Only really soldiers, not really in civilians, whereas the 1688-89 siege did have maybe up to about 10,000 casualties, and probably something similar in the French army of James as well. Finally, I would suggest that history is rewritten by the victors. Okay, the parliamentarians did win this particular siege, but within 10 years, the royalists were back in power, and there probably was a desire to rewrite history, just to ignore anything that the parliamentarians had achieved during that time. And I did talk already about one of the only references that you'll find, and that is in the Billy Kelly book and chapter 2 on the forgotten siege of Derry. If you want to get a bit more information about the complicated nature of the Civil War, this Treville Royal book, 1638 to 1660, The Wars of the Three Kingdoms, gives a lot of detailed information about that. So that's all, folks. That is basically my talk for this evening. However, draw your attention to other talks that are upcoming for the Northwest Historical Association for the rest of the year. Now, unfortunately, due to the coronavirus pandemic, these may not occur on the dates scheduled. And I'm sure if you enjoyed listening to my talk, you may wish to come along to other meetings of the Archaeological and Historical Society, and the contact details are there if you wish to contact Roy McCulloch or Ian Bartlett to find out more information. And finally, I would normally invite any questions, and in this case, if you've enjoyed the talk, or perhaps if you haven't, if you think I've got something wrong or I've admitted something, please make a comment on my Facebook page or my YouTube account. And it'd be great to get a bit of feedback and incorporate that into future presentations. So thank you for your attention, and goodbye. Hello, my name is David, and I run a walking tour business at Derry/Londonderry called Derry Danders Walking Tours. I encourage visitors to linger longer in Londonderry and enjoy a dander around Derry. My profession as an accountant has allowed me to travel extensively in Europe, and in particular in Spain, France and Sweden. I always try to learn about the local culture and history of the cities that I have visited, and a walking tour from a local guide has always been a must-do experience. From my own personal experiences as a tourist, I have learned what makes a good walking tour, and I hope to deliver this as I convey to my clients the rich history of my home city and county of Derry/Londonderry. My mission is to provide informative and entertaining historical tours, and I always strive to be politically neutral and historically accurate. Due to the wealth of historical information that exists about the city, the biggest challenge has not been what to include, but what to leave out. I was born, bred, and am a lifetime resident of the city. I am a passionate student and reader of history. I am a member of Visit Derry, the local tourist organisation, Tour Guides NI, and as such am public liability insured. I am also a long-time member of the Friends of the Derry Walls and other local historical societies. I am steadily developing my contacts with other tourist organisations and attractions, and work as part of a connected and collaborative network for the benefit of visitors to the area. I am currently able to offer a number of add-on visits to attractions in this area, including the Guildhall, St Columb's Cathedral, the Playhouse and the St Columba Heritage Centre. I have also developed a young person's treasure hunt to keep the younger visitor engaged during my tours around the Derry Walls. I invite you on my tours, which can be customised for you. See you in Derry/Londonderry soon.